Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to part 4 of Defending the Defense Industrial Base webinar series. Part 4 will feature Leslie from OCD Tech and Ozzie from IntelliGRC. They will be discussing safeguarding CUI and a new approach to GRC. After that, we're going to have a short open forum Q&A, which will be moderated by our Master of Ceremonies, Levi from NeQter Labs. There is a Q&A section, so please feel free to ask all the questions that you want throughout the presentations, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end. And then after that, we'll wrap up everything. We do have a lot of information to cover today. So at this time, I'm going to turn things right over to Leslie and we'll get started.
Hi, thank you, Tim. Thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to introduce myself briefly so that I can save as much time to talk about the important topic of safeguarding CUI. I've been supporting the Department of Defense for the last 14 years, and I spent the last 9 years on active duty and as a contractor in OUSD ANS and DoD CIO doing policy. So I come from inside the department, and I'm hoping to offer a unique perspective into CUI. I spent a couple of years on active duty in the intelligence community classifying information, and so CUI is but a new type or a different type of classifying information. So I hope to provide some insight into how we can do that. Next slide, please. All right, so everyone wants to know, what is CUI? So these two short paragraphs are the book definition of what CUI is. You can read them, you can go look this up. So I'm not going to read verbatim for you what they are. I do want to explain what CUI is, where it comes from, and who actually controls the CUI program. So the National Archives actually owns the federal CUI program. It was established by an executive order about 10 years ago by President Obama. And the executive agent of CUI is the ISOO, the Information Security Oversight Office. They are the ones who publish all of the federal guidelines for how we handle it, process it, store it, destroy it, and all of that stuff. So it's not just a DoD program, it applies to every executive branch agency. So every contract that you have with an executive branch agency has the potential for having CUI on it. So I just want to make it clear that it is not specific to just the DoD. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is probably one of the biggest and most confusing questions involved in the CMMC and with CUI is, do I have CUI? So the first place you should go look for that answer is with your contracting officer representative. You should ask them point blank, do I have CUI? Because we know that DoD and federal agencies have not been good about marking their CUI. And in fact, DoD just implemented their CUI program. So until just this year, DoD was marking things as FOUO. They were marking things as LES for law enforcement sensitive, potentially SBU as a marking. All of those things now mean CUI. They've always been CUI, but CUI is the new name for it. So if you have questions, go ask your contracting officer. Look at the files that you receive from your client. Look for those markings. Look for FOUO. Look for distribution statements. It's not true that every distribution statement means that you have CUI, because some distribution statements actually mean for public release, but it's an indicator that gives you more information to go look further to find out what type of information you have. Again, check for FOUO and other legacy markings. You should also consider the documents that you're creating in support of your executive branch agency. The CUI registry, it's housed on the National Archives website. I've put the link here for everyone's reference, but it provides a comprehensive list of all of the categories of CUI. And what I mean by comprehensive is, if the information that you think is CUI is not on that list, then it is not in fact CUI. So that should be your reference for information that you think may be sensitive in nature. And while we're on this topic of information that you think might be CUI, I also want to talk about FCI, federal contract information, because those two terms sometimes get put in the same sentence, and I'm not sure if people are truly clear about what the difference between FCI and CUI is. So I actually had a conversation with a representative from the ISU to clarify this question for me, because I was getting confused and I didn't really understand what FCI is. So FCI is any information that you produce for or on behalf or in support of a federal contract. So think of it as information that you would share with another company under an NDA. You sign that agreement and you agree that everything you guys discuss will not be talked about with other entities. And that's what FCI is. So that is the baseline requirement for how you protect government information. FCI is protected by FAR 52, and it's equivalent to the CMMC level 1, which is why the CMMC level 1 applies to everybody except for the COTS products, because that is the protection requirement for FCI. So if you think something might be CUI, go check out the CUI registry and do your own investigation to determine if the information that you're creating may fall into some of those categories. Just because information is not labeled as CUI does not necessarily mean that it's not CUI. We know that the government has a bad history of accurately marking their information. So just because you receive a data dump from your client does not mean that it is not CUI. As the authorized holder of CUI, you are allowed to mark it. If you realize that something is CUI and it's not marked properly, you should mark it. Don't just assume that it's not CUI because someone else or your client didn't mark it for you. CUI is generated for or on behalf of an executive branch agency, which means you can create CUI. It's not only the DoD or the federal government that creates CUI. You as a contractor can create it. Even if you don't get CUI from your client, you can still produce it in support of a contract. But it should be noted that for information to be considered CUI, it is the government that must be asking you to produce that information. So for example, if you go to the CUI registry and you see that PII is a form of CUI, and I apologize for all these acronyms, but personally identifiable information is a category of CUI if and only if the government is asking you to collect that information. So if you are creating bolts and nuts for the DoD, your company records and your roles and all of your HR stuff is not CUI because it is not the department that is asking you to create and store that information. However, if you are managing personnel records for the Army and all of that soldier data that you're collecting, that would be CUI. That PII would be considered CUI because it is the government asking you to collect and store that information. So I just wanted to make sure that that is clear, that CUI is only the information that DoD is asking you to create or store or transmit or process. Next slide, please. Okay, so where do you find the CUI? And the answer really is anywhere. It can be in drawings, technical drawings, schematics, your designs, anything like that. It can be in Word documents. It can be in Excel files. If you are getting information, if the DoD is directing you to conduct research and they give you access to a whole bunch of information and you're conducting analysis on that information, potentially all of the data inputs are unclassified, but you putting your analysis into it at the direction of the department and providing it back to the department, that potentially could be CUI because you are giving insight into what the department cares about. So be cognizant about that type of stuff. PowerPoints can also have CUI. If you're assigning values or the department's assigning values to information that you're presenting, that potentially could be CUI. A slide deck in a template form may be unclassified, publicly releasable if it's not filled in, but as soon as it gets filled in, it could raise to the level of CUI. Also, your notebooks and handwritten sticky notes. Just because you're not typing it doesn't mean it's not CUI. If anybody spent any time in the intelligence community, maybe you will notice the people running around with notebooks that are labeled, secret or top secret SCI. And the same thing applies to CUI. You should label your notebook. If you know you're going to government meetings and you're taking notes that potentially have CUI, you should be labeling that notebook that you're taking notes in to alert anybody that your notebook potentially has CUI in it. And hard copies and soft copies, this is just reiterating the same point that CUI can be in any form. It doesn't have to be just produced in a PDF or Word document. It can also be printed And as soon as you print that CUI, that piece of paper becomes CUI, and also that printer that you're printing from. You should be cognizant about what's on that network and who has access to that printer and where is that printer stored. So these are all the things that we should be aware of, like how CUI really does touch almost everything. If you're using CUI, be really cognizant about where you're putting it or talking about it even. Having conversations on the phone can be considered CUI. So yeah, just things to consider when you're trying to map out where all the CUI may reside. Next slide, please. Okay, the CUI lifecycle. So I created this website back in June. It's dodcui.com. DoD just recently published or put out on the web dodcui.mil. My website came first, but imitation is the best form of flattery. Their site looks very different from mine, but I wanted to create a singular source of information for DoD CUI because it is, I think, in my humble opinion, the most misunderstood part of the whole CMMC and NIST 800-171. So I tried to put together this diagram to talk about CUI in every stage of its life cycle, to kind of break it down to make it manageable. I don't believe that everyone handles CUI at every stage of the life cycle. Most people don't necessarily create it. They may just receive it. Some people may not disseminate it, but they may create it. So I want to break down each stage of the life cycle to give a little bit more information to help people understand what it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so CUI, the moment you create it, the moment you put it down on paper, the moment you create a diagram, the moment you write a note on a sticky note, that is when it becomes CUI. There's not some magical designation fairy that has to give you authority to create CUI. If you are creating information and documentation in support of a contract and on behalf of the government, the moment you create it, it is CUI. So the first three steps may seem like they all happen at once, and sometimes they happen very quickly, but they are three separate things you should absolutely think about when you are in fact creating CUI. So first you create it, you write it down. The second thing you need to realize is that, yes, I am creating this in support of a government contract. This is government information, and I believe that this is CUI. So once you think you have created CUI, you have to, one, identify it, that it is in fact CUI, and two, designate it. And by designate, I mean determine what type of CUI it is. So this whole section can be a whole nother hour-long slideshow. But bottom line up front, there are 145 categories of CUI based on the CUI registry. And there are two, quote, flavors of CUI, and the word flavor is what the ISU uses to define these two flavors of CUI. It's CUI basic and CUI specified. Every single one of the 145 categories of CUI are either CUI basic or CUI specified or both. Yes, one category of CUI can be both basic and specified. CUI basic is the basic type of CUI, which means that the handling and documentation, that the way you house and process and store CUI basic is just that. It's NIST 800-171. All of the guidelines that they publish about CUI applies to CUI basic. CUI specified, it's not a higher level of CUI. It just means that there are additional laws or regulations that govern how you handle it. For example, ITAR is a type of CUI, and it sometimes is CUI specified, and there are very clear ways to handle ITAR information that are all based on the laws surrounding the type of ITAR that you may have. I actually have a slide here in a few minutes that talk about where to find that type of information. All right, so you've gone to the CUI registry, you've identified what kind of CUI you have, you've determined if it's CUI basic or specified, and if it's specified, you've gone and looked at the additional handling requirements and applied. Now it's time to apply the labeling for your CUI. So marking and labeling your CUI is 100% dependent upon the type of CUI you have. CUI Basic, the minimum marking requirement for CUI Basic is at the top for the DoD. This is DoD specific guidelines. Every executive agency has a different handbook for how you mark and label CUI. The minimum standard is the ISO standard, and DoD has added some additional requirements above and beyond the ISO. So for DoD, basic CUI Basic must have a header and a footer, which is different from the ISO. The ISO only requires the header and makes the footer optional, but within DoD, the footer is mandatory. So CUI Basic must say at least CUI or controlled across the top and the bottom. If the CUI is CUI specified, you must include the type of CUI that it is. The CUI registry has a very explicit nomenclature for how you shorten the CUI category. So that's why using the CUI registry is very important when you're creating CUI, because you need to understand if it's basic or specified and mark it accordingly. Again, here's the URL for the marking list, because you need to make sure that you're using the right acronym for the type of CUI that you have. Next slide, please. Okay, storing CUI. I think everyone's killing this with NIST 800-171, with the CMMC. Everyone focuses on the security controls for how to handle or how to store CUI. So I'm not going to cover all of that because that is covered ad nauseum elsewhere. But you also need to be cognizant about the physical environment that your CUI resides in. So it's not all cybersecurity controls on your computer and endpoint devices. It also, you must also store it physically. Sometimes you store it physically in your office, and it needs to be a controlled environment. By controlled, I mean that you control who comes and goes into the environment. You're escorting your visitors to make sure that they're not escorted. For example, at home, if lots of people are working remotely now, it is okay to view a CUI and to have CUI at your house. You just have to make sure it's stored in a locked drawer and make sure that random people don't have access to that drawer. And if you're shredding it, you have to use, we'll talk about destruction here in a minute, but it is okay to have it in a physical environment. You should make sure that it's actually controlled. So the next stage in the lifestyle would be to disseminate it. If you need to send out that information to someone outside, and by disseminate, I mean outside of your organization, you need to ensure that the CUI, the person you're sending the CUI to, is an authorized holder. And the reason why I don't say they need a need to know is because it is very explicit in the executive order that establishes CUI that there is no need to know basis for disseminating CUI. In fact, the executive order describes this need to share. Everybody who has a legal authorized purpose to have this information should have access to it. So the only real requirements are that they are authorized, meaning they have a legal, governmental, work-related purpose to get this information. You should also only disseminate it in accordance with the distribution statements and applicable laws. The distribution statements will say things like no foreign or government only, or those kinds of things. They will be very explicit in who you can and cannot share that information with. Also consider removing the CUI if you don't know if somebody is authorized, or if you don't think they have any real work reason to know some of the information. You can remove the CUI before you disseminate a document. It would reduce that the level of the documentation to FCI. It would take it down from CUI to FCI. So there are still controlling requirements for how to handle it, but at least it doesn't have that higher level of protection. You can remove, you can put something in PDF and apply redaction boxes and remove the all the underlying metadata behind the redactions. I used to do this in the intelligence community all the time. I would take a TS SCI document and bring it all the way down to the unclassified for public release via PDF redaction boxes. So it is possible, but I recommend at least having two eyes on a document before you do that kind of work, because you want to make sure that you're actually taking out all of the CUI before you send it to somebody who's not an authorized holder of CUI. The next part of the life cycle, or one of the final stages of the life cycle, is to destroy it. You have to destroy hard and soft copies. The policy says that you should, quote, completely destroy it, meaning that you are rendering it completely unreadable, readable, indecipherable, and irrecoverable. There is a NIST guideline for how you do that. It's NIST 800-88. So if you have any specific questions about how to actually do that, you should reference that document. And then Another final step in the CUI lifecycle is decontrol. And by decontrol, I mean you ask the government for permission to make it not considered CUI anymore. There are some types of CUI like PII, which will never be decontrolled. But if you come across some information that seems outdated or it seems like it shouldn't be controlled anymore, there's an official process that you can go through. It's outlined in the DoD instruction 5230.09. But you don't have the authority as an authorized holder to just on your own accord make it not CUI anymore. There's an official process. So don't just assume something's old and therefore not CUI. You have to get it officially approved. Next slide, please. All right, so this is, I think, my last slide, and I want to kind of walk everybody through the CUI registry on the National Archives website. I realize that the words are very small. This is not meant to be read because you can go look at all this information yourself, but I want to kind of walk you through what information is on the CUI registry and why it's very helpful. So starting from left to right, the leftmost part of the screen, it's a portion of the registry, and this is how it's organized. It has the index grouping on the left-hand side. Those are not categories of CUI. Those are just category groupings. And as you can see, the defense category only has 4 types of CUI. This does not mean that all DoD CUI is in those 4 categories. So I'm not sure why they've grouped it in such a small grouping. DoD CUI can in fact be in maybe almost all of the CUI categories. So don't think that just those 4 categories are CUI. So I've called out export control because a lot of people talk about ITAR as if it's not CUI and that it's some other special category. And not that it's not special, but it's just a category of CUI. So if you click on export control, it'll pop up this another screen, or you go to a separate page. The top blurb is what you'll see at the top of the screen. It describes the category. So it'll give you like a very vague, brief overview of what this type of CUI entails. It'll tell you how it's supposed to be marked, and it'll tell you what the banner markings should be. So the ISU requires just that banner marking to go at the top, but in DoD, that banner marking goes at the top and the bottom. So this middle block, it's just, it's part of the same page if you scroll down to the bottom. And this provides all of the laws and regulations that govern the handling of this type of information. So export control has a ton of laws associated with it, only 2 of which, the 22 CFR, which are ITAR. So it'll give you links to the external references for how to go find out more information. But more importantly, it tells you when the information is basic and when it is specified. And again, it will give you the proper marking for the CUI when it is specified. And then the furthest to the right column is the sanction column. Some of the types of CUI have very explicit criminal and civil penalties associated with mishandling that. So if you're interested, it's really boring because it links directly to the laws. But it'll tell you how much money you owe the government if you violate that, or how much time in jail you might spend if you violate the handling requirements of that type of CUI. So that wraps up my overview of CUI.
All right, at this time, thank you, Leslie, for the overview on CUI. At this time, we're going to turn things over to Ozzie so he can talk about a new approach to GRC.
Sure. Happy Friday, everybody, and thank you, Tim and BDO, for organizing this and having me participate. And thank you to Levi as well for handling the conversations. So what I wanted to set the stage with is essentially the discussion topic that I'm going to be covering is going to be a different approach to GRC as a strategy, but also as a solution, GRC being governance, risk management, and compliance. I wanted to premise the conversation with, I tried my best not to make it a sales pitch and not make it seem like another GRC tool. However, I did want to provide at least some insights into our approach to a GRC solution and how we're tackling that space with our background. Next slide, please. All right, just to give you some background information. So the company that I work for is Cybersecurity Consulting. We're a DIB contractor ourselves. We work with multiple federal agencies and commercial organizations. Our clients range from direct commercial organizations within the defense industrial base. We are partners with the Virginia NIST MEP Partner Program. So we have worked with the MEP network in supplying support services to small DIB companies navigating the DFAR 7012. And then we also have some expertise in other frameworks such as SOC 2 and HIPAA, RMF, FedRAMP, and CMMC. Primarily, our business focuses on software engineering services for the federal government. We have a lot of clients in the DoD, the Army Reserve, Army National Guard, just to name a few, DHS, and GSA. Our company typically provides software development for HR solutions for these federal agencies, and my team specifically supports the information assurance processes around those systems that are being developed for these federal clients. So typically FedRAMP, ATO, RMF processes, and things along those lines. One thing I did want to mention is within our organization, I'm going to say back in 2015 or 2016, when we were made aware of the DFAR 7012, we ourselves decided to navigate and implement all of the security control requirements in 800-171. And at that time, being a software engineering and a solutions company, we thought to ourselves, hey, let's see if we can automate or try to streamline our efforts in, one, assessing where we stand, two, managing and maintaining our compliance. At that point in time, we did some research, looked into the GRC solution space, and saw various tools, enterprise tools. We felt that there was a gap in the market regarding small business at that time, and to include automation in the GRC solution space. So what we ended up doing is developing our own tool in-house for internal use only. At that time, that's when we started telling some friends in the industry about it, and everybody was pretty much asking, hey, how can I use the tool, or how can I get involved? And I'll talk a little bit more about our approach with that in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of take a step back and look at the problem statements around not just GRC software solutions that exist, but also the GRC strategy in the industry. One of the common trends that we keep coming across, or several common trends that we keep coming across, is either if it's a solution, it's enterprise focused, it's costly, it's expensive. If it's a team managing your GRC strategy, those are very expensive skill sets and very difficult to acquire those skill sets. The other aspect is a lot of these tools and methods and strategies in the GRC space are manual. There's not a ton of automation. And it's very difficult to scale. One of the things that we constantly come across is spreadsheets galore and documentation nightmares, and how do you effectively manage and maintain compliance, and how do you measure compliance on an ongoing basis for your information systems and assets. And so one of the things that we try to emphasize is integrations with tool sets. A lot of things that we're coming across is disparate tools, silos of teams. There's no cross-correlation, there's no integration really happening. And then another thing that we're coming across a lot is there's no black or white answers, and a lot of these approaches are not circumstantial. They don't take into consideration, mitigating controls or different use case scenarios that would support the business and help them efficiently navigate and implement control objectives. So that's something that we tried to tackle with our approach as best as possible. Next slide, please. So going on to the solution itself, again, I'm trying to premise this conversation not around a sales pitch of a software product, but more along the lines of our strategy in developing a solution and hopefully helping others understand what they could be doing, or other vendors to understand what they could be doing to help support small businesses navigating security compliance requirements. So one thing I wanted to start with is the solution itself and how we tackled the creation of our GRC solution. So the solution, IntelliGRC, it follows the NIST RMF process at a fundamental basic level. And the reason why we decided to do that, agnostic of a framework or a standard itself, our background has been in NIST RMF. We feel that it's very mature and very robust. The workflows and the steps in the NIST RMF process we feel are well defined and have very granular details and instructions. So the overall application itself and how we navigated, the workflow essentially follows that core fundamental of NIST RMF. Another thing we also did is incorporate NIST 853 control objectives. Even looking at something like 171, it was derived from 853. When we first tackled 171, we had struggled with looking at 171 requirements in that they're very high level, generic, and vague. So our attempt at first was to break down a security requirement from 171 into bite-sized chunks that can be quantified better or measured. And at that point, that's when we took the mappings from the 800-171 publication and said, we're going to focus on the 53 objectives and validate it against the requirements themselves. So in our tool, we do have most of our assessment objectives focused around 853 and then mapping to a framework like 171 and CMMC. The next thing that we try to tackle is the scoping aspect. A lot of the times, most of what we come across is scope creep, where an organization or a system is attempting to scope the boundary and understand how to scope that boundary. And in those cases, they go down this never-ending rabbit hole of not being able to clearly identify assets in scope, and then having this blurry line drawn around their boundary in which the assets are unclear of whether they are involved in the system boundary or not. So one thing we tried to tackle well is a system scoping wizard capability in the tool that guides an organization towards better scoping their system boundary and understanding their system boundary and where their responsibilities lie. One other thing that we tried to do is we said we felt that there was a gap in between the GRC solution space and the technology solutions out there that help you measure or determine where you stand against technical controls. We felt that there was that gap between these technical solutions that are already out there and the GRC solutions that are already out there. There are some attempts to marry those two worlds, but we felt they were more enterprise focused rather than small business. So at that point in time, that's when we started to develop our own scanning tool, in which essentially we allow two types of deployments. It is a on-premise black box network scanner and or an agent-based scanner for endpoints. And the scanning engine that we're leveraging is no different than the same engine as some of these large company scanning tools that are already out there. It's the same engine, and it utilizes mostly what's called OVAL, Open Vulnerability Assessment Language, and SCAP content, which we'll explain a little bit further here. But what that intent was is to automatically discover and collect data as it relates to your assets that are technology specific and correlate them and cross-correlate them back to the security controls and requirements so that you could better gauge how you're addressing each individual requirement at a lower level that can be quantified. The other thing we tried to tackle is the tailoring aspect, with the understanding that tailoring can apply to various levels in a GRC solution. It could be, tailoring in or out security control objectives, tailoring in or out assets, tailoring the assessment objectives to focus in on what you need to focus in on. For example, and in a lot of these standards and frameworks, the variables are loosely defined or they're not defined at all. And it'll say something like an organization defined variable. So for example, if you have a password complexity requirement, the actual variable is driven by your risk profile and your determination. Company A may say 8-character passwords, where company B may say 12-character passwords. We take that aspect into account when we talk about trying to scan for technical configurations and verify where you stand. Next slide, please. As most GRC solutions out there pretty much cover this portion, which is the artifact generation. As everyone navigates CMMC, 800-171, they're generating their system security plans and POAMs. Those are all things that we've tried to incorporate and allow further customization. as well as policy and procedure document templates. Our intent was to create a robust set of documentation that can be exported from a tool, but managed within the tool itself and integrated with the data points that are in the tool. So with the artifact generation capability that we tried to tackle in our solution, we made sure that we had some basic documentation functionality like versioning, change management control, and approval mechanisms built into the solution. Another thing that we tried to tackle is API integration. So there are a lot of solutions out there, technology solutions that offer API endpoints and targets. Our intent was to, instead of replacing your security tools, say you're using Nessus as a vulnerability scanner, or using configurations in the cloud like Office 365, our intention was not to replace any of those solutions you already have, but rather integrate to be able to make certain determinations on how you're meeting certain control objectives as best as possible. So we've built an API capability, and that is an ongoing, expanding capability as we introduce more and more integrations with other solutions out there. And then lastly, the continuous monitoring feature that we're trying to target. So for continuous monitoring, there's always this challenge. I mean, even if you look at CMMC level 3 or 800-171, you'll see a requirement in there that says you have to implement a continuous monitoring program. A lot of people tend to ask us, well, what does that include? What does that involve? And so typically what that involves is a selection of security control objectives in which there would be a frequency defined or an action defined based on an event. And so, for example, once a month you patch system, or once a year you review documentation and update, things along those lines. So we tried to build robust functionality in the tool that would cover and streamline a lot of those things. So for example, managing action plans like taskers and subtaskers that can feed into your POAM. With the API integration, we even have the ability to integrate with your existing project management or ticketing tool. So you can manage all your taskers there, and then the tool can utilize the outputs from those taskers. And then additionally, creating and managing SOPs, standard operating procedures. So for example, if you have a control objective that references a frequency of, say, vulnerability scanning once a month your information systems, you can utilize SOP templates in the tool or generate your own SOP in which it's a application-driven and interactive checklist process that you can assign to someone. This way, as an individual navigates an SOP checklist or a process, they can record the results of the process and the activities of the process in the tool, which automatically update related control objectives and metrics. And then further on the continuous monitoring is the monitoring the technical control objectives as well via the scanning tool and integrations with other tools as well. Next slide, please. All right, so I wanted to try to explain our strategy and our approach, just to give a little insight into how we navigated the development of our tool, our functional capabilities, our data points, why we're doing things the way we see that they should be done. And so with that, I want to start with the scoping aspect, and I'm hoping that people can take away from this discussion some strategies and ideas relative to how we tackle the problems in our solution. So typically we always, this is something that you're always going to hear with an assessor, an auditor, or anyone consulting or providing input on your compliance programs. It's scoping. Scoping, again, we talked about scope creep and a lot of challenges around that. So typically what we recommend is identifying certain elements. So if you take a look at this pyramid on the right-hand side, there are elements here defined that can help you try to drive the scoping of your system boundary. And again, system boundary being this theoretical circle that you're drawing around your assets. So the first thing that we normally do is, you have your organization, Your organization will have business lines. These are going to be your mission and business objectives. What are you doing to generate revenue? And typically you're selling services or products. That you always fall into those two buckets. And then what are your internal business functions? These are functional roles within your organization that support the business lines. So you may have an HR, an IT, an FSO, you may have project-specific roles and things along those lines. And then you essentially identify your sensitive information types. And we call it in the solution sensitive information types to avoid any negative connotations, but those could be essentially your CUI if that's what's in scope. So if you identify your sensitive information types, in which we have a wizard in our tool that helps you navigate and understand, based on your business, what is it that you're storing, processing, and transmitting relative to the business. And so, again, services will have its own set of things, and products will have their own set of things. And at the end of the day, as you identify the sensitive information type, you want to further go along the lines of saying, okay, we're going to select security controls, in which if it's CUI, you're focused in on 800.171 or CMMC level 3, for example, and those are things that are automatically driven in our tool. And then you want to identify your assets. Your assets are your people, your technology, and your facilities. So that's essentially where you would apply your security control objectives. So for our identification of assets, when we say people, it could cover anything, right? It could cover employees, contractors, vendors, anyone who has access or can store, process, and transmit the sensitive information type that's been identified. Devices, similarly, if a device can store, process, or transmit the sensitive information type, it is automatically assumed as in scope. And then you have your facilities, where you would essentially focus in on your physical security control objectives, where you identify your facilities, and then we have some attributes of a facility in which the tool helps you identify sub-facilities, is what we call it. But essentially, if you have a building, right, and that's your place of business, within that building you have, say, a data center or a server room, we want to identify that in a tool so that we can apply robust logic to it. And what I mean by that is the risk metrics that we're deriving would be different based on the front door of the building being locked versus the server room having a more stricter means of controlled access. So knowing those distinct elements helps drive the tool's logic and intelligence in recommending how you remediate a gap or identify a gap. The other thing I want to mention in terms of identifying assets is our scanner tool. It's an optional tool. It's not required to be used, but what it does do is it helps you identify technology assets potentially in scope. And what I mean by that is we've been beta testing this tool for the last 2 years. We started development of this IntelliGRC solution back in 2016, early 2016. And we've been testing it with some small businesses that we've been providing services to. And what we've been doing is building a lot of logic and intelligence in the tool in terms of, if you have an asset, a technology asset, say an endpoint computer, a desktop, a laptop, and then you have servers, whether they be physical or virtual, then you have networks and network topologies of VLANs and ACLs and subnets. We wanted to, based on your identification of the sensitive information and identifying where that information lives, we wanted to derive correlation of endpoints. So for example, if you have, let's say, a directory service that provides identities to your people and your devices, we can look into that and understand, privileges, permissions, and things along those lines, but also from the networking level, understanding interconnectivity. So if you have 2 VLANs and you're stating this VLAN is particularly siloed or segmented for the purposes of storing and processing and transmitting CUI, the tool will try to essentially take a look at if it can traverse the network VLAN to the VLAN from a non-CUI authorized VLAN, and testing ports, protocol, services, looking for things like remote desktop, SMB, CIFS, anything that can provide a capability to access the data that you're protecting or exfiltrate that data. And so it'll look at that and try to automatically assume, hey, even though you imagine this VLAN to be the only VLAN scope for CUI, we see the ability to access the data on that network from other networks. Therefore, all the assets in that network is going to be in scope. And then similarly with permissions, you're looking at individual accounts and account assignments to people and correlating whether they may be accessing the data. And then with regards to other means of scoping, we have built-in questionnaire decision trees and workflows that guide an individual towards understanding their assets that are in scope and out of scope. And then with regards to understanding your logical and physical boundaries, typically it's always recommended to say, just ask these fundamental questions of, does this asset in question store, process, or transmit the sensitive information type that has been identified? And then second to that is, does the asset provide security functions, or in NIST RMF, they refer to it as an enabling asset to the system boundary. What that essentially means is, if you have a solution that is providing security functionality to your CUI boundary, you want to include that in your assessment decision-making and your determinations in how its relationship is to the CUI boundary. Does it have segmentation capabilities to avoid accessing or exfiltrating that sensitive data? And what kind of security functions is it providing or support to that system boundary? And then with that, we have this concept of system interconnections. This is a concept that NIST RMF follows, which is identifying external service providers, whether it be cloud services, hosting services, co-located data services, people services, it doesn't matter. If that interconnection is either providing a security function or has the ability to store, process, or transmit the sensitive information in scope, it is part of your system boundary. You may not own the back-end infrastructure. You may not own the assets at that interconnection, but you are paying for services in which they are still in scope. And so there's some additional things you need to take into consideration relative to your compliance strategy. Next slide, please. So the other thing I wanted to mention is, so once you're done scoping your system boundary, understanding your assets that are in scope, and understanding the sensitive information that you're trying to protect, we have this workflow process to perform a gap assessment. And the intention is to introduce as much automation and logic into the workflow to streamline the overall gap assessment process. So with the gap assessment, we have four primary assessment objectives. So the assessment objectives are targeted interview questionnaires. We do provide a questionnaire content and decision tree that scopes the user and navigates the user towards more meaningful responses. And the questionnaire can be set up to target IT responsible individuals, HR, et cetera. And it's similar to a SurveyMonkey, where you point to the individual, they receive an invite to join the application and go through their questionnaire, and then you get a notification saying they've completed their responses. The second thing is a reviewing of documentation. So in any assessment, this is usually the most time-consuming portion, right, is reviewing documentation, policies, and procedures, for example. So what we try to do to automate that as best as possible is leveraging a natural language processing engine and a little bit of machine learning, in which you would upload policy procedure documents. And what the tool will do is we've created a checklist association to topics. So for example, access control is a topic. It is a family and a domain in CMMC and 800-171. But what we wanted to do is see, okay, if you've uploaded any policies or procedures, can we automatically read through those documents using the NLP engine and correlate the content, whether it's a sentence or a paragraph or a section of the document, to those control objectives. This way, as you're performing a gap assessment or you're assessing documentation coverage, you can automatically receive the shortcuts to say, this section covers this section covers that control, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to streamline that as fast as possible, and NLP helped us achieve a portion of that. And then the last portion is the technical control assessment. So again, we have the scanning tool, we have the API integrations and integrations with other tools. So the on-premise scanner or the agent-based scanner does a bit of network discovery. It can scan files. It can scan service accounts and services that are running. It can scan Active Directory if you're using Active Directory. It can scan network appliances and try to look at configurations on all those endpoints. We do have a robust set of SCAP content that is derived from various sources, whether it be STIGs or CIS benchmarks. And what we've done is essentially crosswalked the different SCAP rules to the specific control objectives. And so that our intent was to try to streamline the determination of whether you're meeting something. And then again, you can tailor that as well. So you could say, you know, this is my session termination variable of 15 minutes. And then the API aspect is focusing in on integrating with cloud services or other services or other tools. So for example, if you're using Office 365, we built an API that can connect to Office 365, collect and retrieve configurations, and correlate those configuration items back to controls so that you can determine if you're doing something. Part of that is also building a robust list of recommendations on what to do to remediate using those vendor-provided customer or shared responsibility matrices, where they say, we're responsible for these activities, you're responsible to configure these things. And then also consuming other tool outputs, like if you're using a vulnerability scanning tool or a SIEM tool, we can consume outputs from those tools to try to derive any meaningful information out of those tools. And then lastly, you can create manual test cases as well as you see fit. And so again, one other thing that we're trying to do is on the outputs, for example, if you're building a system security plan, your meat of your system security plan is going to be your control implementation statements. So we're building a robust library of seeded content via the NIST OSCAL project, which is a different discussion for a different day, in which we try to seed control implementation statements based off of what was witnessed in the assessment objectives. Next slide, please. So I know we're running out of time, so I'm gonna try to streamline and push through this last portion here. Wanted to quickly mention the future of IntelliGRC. We are attempting to open some open source projects and some crowdsourcing content capabilities. This is in support of the NIST OSCAL content, the control framework mappings, remediation content. For example, if they're a vendor that has a technology solution that solves a specific problem very well for one organization in one industry vertical, mapping that and being able to recommend that to you. So we're building a open source component to our solution and our approach to crowdsource and get further input from vendors, other organizations in the industry trying to navigate this. So the intent is to create the content as open source, and then the tool will just essentially utilize all that content going forward. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. And I know as we were going through this, I just want to take a moment, thank Leslie, thank Ozzie for presenting, and thank you Tim and BDO for setting this all up. We were getting a lot of questions as we were moving through this, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to quickly get to as many of them as we possibly can. I'm going to throw the first one over to Leslie, but if it's not specified in our contract how to specifically treat certain categories of CUI, how are we as a contractor supposed to know exactly what we need to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. You should definitely go ask your contracting officer for more guidance. Surely these contracting officers are getting trained more so than they maybe were when the contract first started. So first, go ask them explicitly. Make them tell you exactly what they know or what they don't know. If they say they don't know, then leverage the CUI registry and the handbook, the DoD CUI website. Go use all of the resources that are finally coming online to see if you can't figure it out, and then bring it back to your contracting officer to have that conversation. So the DFARS Clause 7012 is a mandatory statement. So it appears in every contract, and some say it's self-deleting if you don't have CUI. But if you don't know if you have CUI or not, it's kind of hard to self-delete it. So do your own research. Don't put all the onus on DoD. I know we want to, and they should, quote, should be doing stuff, but we need to do our due diligence as well to make sure that we're protecting it, even if they aren't helping us.
So it's a really good answer. And I know this next question is actually something you talked a little bit about right after the question got asked, but I'll throw it up there just in case, let you go over it, because I know it's a question I get all the time. If information is ITAR protected, does that automatically make it CUI? And if it does, am I required to then mark it?
Absolutely. Yes, ITAR is a form of CUI. ITAR has much more stringent controls for who can view it and handle it. And yes, you should absolutely make sure it is marked appropriately, because it probably has a no foreign marking that should be associated with it.
Awesome. Yeah. And I know that ITAR and CUI, there's a lot of confusion between the two, and I get questions all the time in regards to that. So that's a really good answer. In terms of the next question, and I'm going to toss this one over to Ozzie, and I know it's something that we covered a little bit with Tom Cornelius on the first part of the CMMC series, but what are some effective ways that I can scope my CMMC certification boundary? And where exactly would I draw the line to understand what assets are going to be in scope versus what aren't?
Yeah, sure. So kind of, going back to a lot of what Leslie was talking about, right? It starts with identifying that sensitive information, right? Trying to identify in support of your business, whatever it is that you're providing to the federal agency, what are you generating, what are you receiving, what are you storing, what are you processing? Once you do that, then again, going through that process of identifying your assets that are involved, those are people, technology, and facilities, and then identifying if those assets can store, process, or transmit that sensitive information type. And if you look at the definition of process, it includes a lot of extra things like accessing, or touching, or executing, or modifying. It includes a lot of different attributes. So if you go through that process, you can essentially identify all the assets in scope and be able to produce this system boundary and say, okay, now I need to essentially take my list of security control objectives, identify what's applicable to what. Training objectives apply to people, whereas technical controls will apply to technology assets. And then once you have that mapping done, then you can more efficiently and quantifiably measure and determine where you stand, if that helps.
Yeah, that's a really, really good answer. And I'm going to take it back a second. We actually just had this one pop in, and it's going back to what Leslie said a minute ago with, reaching out to your contracts officer and understanding exactly what exactly in the contract could be potentially CUI. And I know it's something the DoD is working very hard day in, day out to train them, make sure that they know what's going on with this. But what do we do if the contract officer and the program manager on the contract just claim that everything in the program is CUI and don't actually specify anything?
Again, do your due diligence and do your research, because I would venture to guess that they probably don't know, and they're just saying that to CYA. So because in the executive order that establishes the CUI program, it very clearly states that if there is a question as to not whether or not something is CUI, like it could be reasonably explained to not be CUI, then it shall not be so designated. So just because somebody is saying that it's CUI, doesn't mean that it's CUI. It has to be part of the CUI registry. It has to be produced in support of a government contract. And yeah, it is very clear how to define something as CUI, not just because a government official tells you that la-di-da-di everything is CUI.
So moving the next question back over to Ozzie and talking a little bit more about IntelliGRC, but I know you mentioned you guys utilizing possibly a data center for the tool. Is that data center FedRAMP compliant?
Sure. Sure, I can answer that one. So IntelliGRC is certainly a SaaS solution that is hosted in Azure in the US regions. It is utilizing the specific services that have gone through a FedRAMP moderate accreditation. The application itself is a Docker Kubernetes modern day application stack with databases that are PostgreSQL and Microsoft SQL Server in the back end. One thing that we are doing as well is when it comes to tools that are being utilized for your CMMC compliance, there's this requirement potentially that says cloud services must be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So we are generating a FedRAMP moderate equivalent system security plan that incorporates all of the controls that are in place for that solution. And a customer could, under NDA, request a copy of that, and that's our way to demonstrate our due diligence. There's a question in there about CMMC. I did want to mention that, yes, we are in the process of, as an applicant, trying to navigate CMMC as well. So the intention, even though that process is still not entirely defined by the AB yet, is to go through a level 3 certification for that solution.
Awesome, and really appreciate that clarification, Ozzie. And with that, I know we just hit 1 o'clock. I'm going to hand it back on over to Tim to talk a little bit about, the final part of this amazing CMMC series. I know this was part 4, part 5 is going to be the conclusion, and we have a really big event planned for everyone next week.
So yeah, thank you all again for joining us today. I know we are right at 1 o'clock and out of time. Real quick, next week is the last event, next Friday. It's a half-day event. We have a ton of people presenting. We're going to do a longer Q&A if there's more questions. Here's a list of all the organizations that are presenting, as well as at the very end, before we hit the Q&A, we'll have a member of the CMMC AB who will be there to present for a little while as well. But at this time, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. And once again, thank you all for joining.